Good evening, everyone. My name is Neily, and I am president of Parents Defending Education. At PDE, we are dedicated to investigating and exposing what's really taking place inside of our schools. As we always say, sunshine is the best disinfectant. But how can you help to shine a light into some of the bad things that are taking place in your school system and figure out what those activist ideologies are? Well, we think that one of the best ways is through public records requests, or FOIAs, Freedom of Information Act. So joining me tonight to talk about these issues are John Riches, who is Director of National Litigation with and General Counsel at the Goldwater Institute. John has a ton of experience with open government laws, so I'm excited to have him with us. And Will Johnson, who is a parent activist in Colorado. Thank you both for joining me, guys.
Thank you, Nikki.
Thanks, Nikki. Great to be on.
All right, John, let's start with you. Our community members have seen the acronym FOIA from us before. So can you explain what a FOIA is? Like, what is this whole public records thing?
Yeah, sure. So a FOIA typically refers to a law, a statute that allows the public access to public information about public activities or activities that are supported with taxpayer dollars. When people say FOIA, they're usually referring to the Federal Freedom of Information Act, which applies to the federal government and its activities. But interestingly, each state also has its own public records laws. And these apply to state government, including local governments, cities, towns. They apply to subdivisions like school districts and other things like special taxing districts. What's really interesting about the state version FOIAs is they tend to be even broader than the federal FOIA. So, transparency is the rule, secrecy is the exception. There's presumptions in the law that favor disclosure, that favor open and transparent government. And what that means, if there's a presumption, is that the tie goes to the requester. So these are really, really good tools. The definition of public information is very broad under them. If an agency or a school district claims that some FOIA exemption applies, the burden's on the district to prove its application. Of course, they vary from state to state. So different rules apply depending on what state you are, what exemptions might apply. What avenues of relief might be available if you're denied a request, whether people are required to pay fees or not. So all of these things, in short, is, it makes it really important for requesters to know that these resources are out there, that they're available. It's important that they know how to craft well-defined public records requests so that they can get the information they're seeking. And, at the end of the day, these things are absolutely essential. The Supreme Court, in a U.S. Supreme Court decision, said that the federal FOIA was vital to the functioning of a democratic society, and it was needed to hold governors accountable to the governed. That's certainly true at the federal level, and that is definitely true at the state and local level, including with our public schools.
So everybody who is employed in a public school system is a government employee. So the principal, the teachers, you can get their emails, their correspondence with each other. I think most people are not even aware of that.
Yeah, absolutely. If it pertains, generally speaking, if it pertains to public business, it's going to be a public record and available to the public. In fact, it can even go beyond district employees who are definitely subject to the FOIA. It could include, contracts, government contracts, even with private parties. If there's taxpayer dollars that are involved, public funds are involved, records that pertain to that sort of activity is also generally available.
That's fascinating. So you can get a huge amount of information, both not only about what your child is learning, for example, but then also them, like district employees, talking about adopting a lesson plan, or why they went with one book over another, to kind of see what their discussions were about some of this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and getting employee communications, requesting employee communications is usually a great tool to discover how the public's business is being transacted. So, if the superintendent is sending out, big emails to everybody, or if two teachers or a teacher and administrator are having a conversation about a specific issue, the public's got a right to know how its business is being conducted. And very often those types of communications are open to public inspection.
All right, next up, Will, your organization that you work with in Colorado has filed a few FOIAs. Can you tell us what that process was like and what you ended up discovering?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks again, Nikki, for having us on and talking about these things, because it is so important. Like you and John were just talking about. To me, it really helps parents own our kids' education, right? And that's one of the most important responsibilities we have to do that. And it's a great tool because it helps to drive transparency, helps us to shine a light, like you were talking about. And when you do that, that drives accountability, right? And it fosters a healthy accountability that we all are owed as parents, as taxpayers, and things like that. So it's a really important tool. And so from the kind of the process standpoint, right? For me as a parent, it was pretty daunting at first, right? Just thinking through, okay, how do I do this? Where do I start? But once you know the basic process and you get one under your belt, it only gets easier. And you realize that, oh, that actually wasn't so hard. So for us, and I think this is probably true of most school districts, the link to the FOIA form and the directions for filling it out are on your school district's website. Now, they might call it something other than FOIA, depending where you live. So like in Colorado, where I'm from, it's called CORA, Colorado Open Records Act. So you'll see it by that name. But every district should have an easy way to access and understand how to do it. And I think one of the most important points for parents is as we're thinking about how do we fill this out? What's the process like? It's to be as specific as we can in the actual wording of our request, the framing up of it, things like that, because that increases your chances of actually getting the information that you want, and without being charged a lot of money to do so. Right. So what does that mean? Well, I think there's a couple key things to be specific on. One is the topic. So using specific keywords. So for example, you don't want to say CRT, right? Because number one, that might not be in the system that you're looking for, and also it's just very general. Instead, say things like anti-racism or equity or culturally responsive. Things like that sound good on the surface, certainly, and we see that more prevalent in the school districts, but they can be a gateway for divisive and regressive messages, right? So being specific on your topic is one. The second point is your format. So are you looking for emails? Are you looking for presentations, contracts, or recordings? Specify that. People, are you communication between the superintendent and the DEI director or specific school board members, things like that, call that out. And one of the most important ones in my experience I've found is be specific on the time frame. So trying to keep it as narrow as possible. Don't leave it open-ended, but put a time frame or a window of time for what you're looking for. So for example, kind of tying all that together, I wouldn't recommend saying something like, I want all communications about CRT or DEI between school district leaders. I wouldn't say that. Instead, I'd say something like, I want emails from the past 3 months between the superintendent and the DEI director that reference the words anti-racism or equity, something like that, because that increases your chances of success. You can always follow up with another FOIA too after your initial one, right? It's detective work, right? So you can always follow up with. There's no max number that you can file, and also knowing the timeline that they have to get back to you. That differs by state and maybe even by district in some occasions. So in my county, I think it's 5 days. So if day 6 rolls around, they haven't gotten back to you yet, send a follow-up, things like that. So that's the basic process that as a parent I've had experience with, and again, get one under your belt and it only gets easier from there.
Okay, perfect. So be concrete, be specific, be kind of defined. So you're not asking for all correspondence from all people for all time.
Yeah.
Do districts charge money, or do they just do this out of the goodness of their hearts?
Oh, they charge money when they can, right? So I think what we've seen is usually they have like the first hour of research is free, but then the clock starts going and they can the dollar amount can rise pretty quickly. So you hear FOIAs that come back and say, well, we can fill this, but it's going to be $5,000, $10,000 to complete, things like that. And if you get something like that, that goes to the point about being as specific and narrowly focused as you can, because it reduces the amount of time that it takes them to complete it. Also, if you get something like that back, I would say try to break it up into bite-sized pieces. So maybe you submit a FOIA with just the last 3 months, and then your next one is, for the 6 months prior, or for different key topics. What we found is successful too is in your parent group, have kind of like a FOIA team. Have a number of parents who know the process, are comfortable doing it, and you can submit multiple FOIAs at once that break it into bite-sized pieces, increase your chances of getting the info you want, and reduce the cost.
I love your tip about knowing the law and knowing the amount of time to respond. I set reminders to myself on my computer when I file one, because you're right. I find more often than not, oh, it's the 5th day. Oh, it's the 6th day. And I think sadly, in some cases, they're kind of hoping you forget about it. So just to be on it, I think is a great tip.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes they might come back and say, I've certainly experienced this, is the response will be, well, we didn't have any information that met your criterion. And so one recommendation I really stress is, don't let that be the end of the conversation, right? So follow up with a note and say, okay, can you explain why? Give me the details on why you weren't able to fill it up. Were the words not specific enough, et cetera? Was the time frame too narrow in some cases, right? And so you're then able to tailor and adjust your FOIA to get the information that you want. So I wouldn't always take their first answer as the final answer.
Awesome. Now, John, your organization, the Goldwater Institute, is releasing a report called The Anatomy of a Public Records Request. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, sure. And great advice from Will. All of those were fantastic points about the right way to get the information that you're seeking quickly and without roadblocks being thrown up for the process. So yeah, it occurred to us that all of these laws exist. They exist in each state, but there's some difference among the laws. So that was the first thing that occurred to us. The second was that for people that aren't used to sort of getting involved in a quote unquote legal issue, or even a public policy type issue, some of this stuff can be a little daunting. Am I going to, how do I communicate with my school district? What's the mechanism by which I should be requesting public information, that sort of stuff. But you know what? At the end of the day, it's not that hard, as long as there's just some basic information that's available. So what we decided to do is create a citizen's guide, a 50-state citizen's guide that does two things. The first is it goes state by state and sort of identifies the high level areas of the law. So can fees be charged? What's the time frame, as Will mentioned, to respond to a FOIA request? What's the definition of a public record? Is it really broad? Is it narrow? What exemptions exist where a school district or another public entity might claim that the information is exempt from disclosure? So it goes through each state and it covers those big categories, so that a parent can go and click on their state and say, okay, so I have a pretty good understanding of what the general parameters are of the law here. And then the second thing it does is it provides a template with an explainer guide. So it literally has a template that is in letter form that parents or other members of the public can go and just add some information to it to submit to their school districts. And the template is meant to be used with an explainer guide that sort of explains each component of a public records request. And some of those things are really obvious and easy, like, include a date for a variety of reasons. That's important. If you say records for the last 3 months, like Will mentioned, well, you're going to want to cut off periods. So you'd say records, from 3 months to the date of this request, past 3 months to the date of this request. Ensure you got the right addressee, the right person to address the requests to. Almost always this information will be on a school district website or another government entity's website. But sometimes it's not. And if it's not, then you want to send it to, a person with decision-making authority and address it to the records custodian. Ensure you include the statutory citation. This request is being made pursuant to Arizona revised statute section such and such, and that information is in the guide. Identify, a time frame, as Will mentioned, and a lot of stuff like that. Just sort of, each component of the request broken out. The guide also provides some tips on the substance of the request. So that's really kind of the important thing, right? What is it the requester is seeking? And the substance is going to look different depending, probably in the first instance, on whether whether the records exist or not. So sometimes a record requester will go, I know what I'm looking for. I'm looking for this contract between the school district and this DEI entity that goes around and shops its wares to all these school districts throughout the country. And so I'm looking for any requests for proposals and any contracts between the school in this particular entity. So that's pretty easy. When that's the case, obviously just identify the records you're seeking with as much specificity as possible. The name of the people involved, the date that some particular action took place, the reports or the names of reports or projects and things like that. But sometimes a requester doesn't know the specific records that they want, but they know the information, the general information they're trying to seek. So, is DEI being taught in the school? Is critical race theory or some other critical theory being taught in this school? And here, the FOIA becomes really more of an art form than anything else. And the idea is not to make a request too broad in the sense that it's going to seek more information than what the requester is looking for. And frankly, more importantly, give the public entity or the school district an excuse to deny or delay a response. But you also don't want it to be too narrow in the sense that it won't capture the information that you're seeking. So, there's a lot of tips that can go along with crafting it so that you kind of find that sweet spot depending on what you're looking for. And finally, the guide provides information about fees, when they can be charged, under what circumstances they can be charged. Is fee waiver available? Oftentimes these statutes allow waiver of any fees if the request is for a non-commercial purpose. So if you're not going to turn around and use it to go like solicit business or something like that, or if the request is in the public's interest, oftentimes fee waivers are available. And then if a request is denied, or if part of a request is denied, the guide provides some recommendations on next steps. So make sure that the denial complied with the law. Make sure that the public entity or the school district is stating whether they're saying the records don't exist, which is one case, or whether the records do exist, but some exemption applies, and get them on the record in writing as to the basis for the denial or the partial denial. And all of this is really, really important because it's creating an administrative record. And in the event you have to go forward and try and compel production of information that's been wrongfully withheld, unlawfully withheld, then you're going to really want a good, clean administrative record to do that. And that starts with the really good FOIA request, and it continues with written communications with the records custodian if there's issues with providing the responsive information. So the idea is to make that easy, self-explanatory, and then if you have questions, if the public has questions, to find some resources that can help walk you through some answers.
That's awesome. I mean, this brings to mind that saying, forewarned is forearmed, because once you know your rights and you know what they are obligated to do, then you can be a much stronger advocate to get the information to stand up for your children. I think that's amazing. And this patchwork of regulations and laws is so confusing. I mean, when we started doing these, I learned that in some states you have to be a state resident, like in Tennessee, to file a FOIA of an institution in Tennessee or Delaware. And so the fact that you guys have put this all in one place is such a tremendous resource. I'm so glad that you guys have done this because it's going to make it a lot easier for people to do these going forward.
Appreciate that, Nikki. Yeah, we hope it'll be helpful.
Will, I think a lot of people are probably watching this and thinking, this seems like kind of a hassle. Does this actually work? Is it worth my time? I mean, what would you say to these people who might say like, should I do this? Or why don't I just ask like the school board at their next meeting and they'll just give me the information?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the first thing I do is tell them to go check out John's guide. That sounds awesome. I'm looking forward to seeing that. John's going to be a great resource. Yeah, I totally get that, right? Is this worth it? Et cetera. And I think I think I would start with, well, it can't hurt. There's only upside into trying to seek out transparency, seek out information. Knowledge is power, right, as we say, and we can use that power for a lot of good that benefits all kids in your school district. I think there's a couple examples I would give where we filed FOIAs that really did yield things that were productive. And again, even if you don't have a big result from it, you're building, right? You're building knowledge. You're staying engaged, learning more about your school district, and at the end of the day, that helps you own your kids' education, as we said, and that's obviously key. So I'd give two examples, and the first one is actually the first one that we did, first FOIA that we filed, and it was about a relationship between our school district and the Anti-Defamation League, or the ADL for short. And it was a program that the ADL offers to school districts, and the program is called No Place for Hate. Right, and that sounds good, and I think with a lot of these things, there's some goodness about these programs. We're against bullying, et cetera, absolutely, but it's run by the ADL, who is very much an ideological organization, and it's very much invasive to the school. Basically starting to kind of control how the school would handle discipline incidents and things like that. And also the program encourages kids to focus on their immutable differences. It tells them to, quote, move on from kindness to become systems changing activists, and doing so with the ADL as their guide to that, right? So those are things that we don't think, number one, is the role of the school. Number two, doesn't help kids thrive when you frame it like that. So what we did is we submitted a FOIA to learn how many schools in our district were participating in the program, and submitted another FOIA for the contract. I think we phrased that one as something like, we'd like the copy of the contract for the 2020-2021 school year between our school district and the ADL for the No Place for Hate program. So back to that example of being as specific as we can on a number of those facets. And I do want to give a shout out to Nikki and Parents Defending Ed. They were great guides for me in this. This was the first one I did, and you guys were great resources, so thank you. So what we did, we got the details back on the requests on both of them. And the contract was for $37,000, as you can see in the screen there. The $37,000 of taxpayer dollars, and we shared that info with the community. And the schools in our district, many of them are still using No Place for Hate, but we've seen several instances where the schools have moved away from it and are replacing it with non-political programs. So, I think that was in part because of shining a light. The second example I would give is around a consultant that our district partnered with, and what we were able to find out there. So our district had recently approved an equity policy, and a lot of people were waiting to see, how is this going to be implemented, or and things like that. And our district hired a consultant to train over 900 teachers and staff in the district in what equity means to them, and therefore how teachers and staff should view equity. And what they did is they trained them to think that equity looks at looking at the world through the lens of racial power struggles, judging a child's current capabilities based on their color of their skin. If outcomes aren't equal, the system must be racist, things like that, right? And the consultant went on to say that parents who disagree with this direction, well, we should ignore those parents. And it was a regressive message that wouldn't help any child, wouldn't empower any child to succeed. So we heard about this presentation, and we FOIA'd it, FOIA'd the actual presentation, the contract as well between them and the district, and emails between the consultant and the district leadership. So 3 separate FOIAs. We got information back on all 3, and we shared that information broadly, both kind of with locally, also with state level media, national media as well. And that sparked a lot of people to express their concerns to the district regarding it. And as a result, the district paused, and they eventually canceled the relationship with this consultant again, because of the information we were able to create transparency on through using FOIAs.
That's amazing. That's a massive success story. That's hugely inspirational. So parents can actually affect change by the information using the information that they find from a public records request.
That's right. Yeah, any parent can do that. Any parent can do that. And once you have that information, then you can share it. And as that knowledge gets shared, real change can occur.
Yeah, it's, as the kids say, you have the receipts, you have the proof, and people can make up their own mind, but you have the actual copies of things that people can see. Awesome. All right, well, let's get to some audience questions now. All right, the first is, can I file a FOIA for a charter school or a private school? John, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. So the answer is, if it's a public entity or supported by public funds, you can, in most circumstances, file a FOIA or a public records request. So that would include public schools, that would include charter schools, which are public schools, but just have charters with the state regarding their operation. It will not apply to private schools that are privately funded. Right? Transparency is for the government and privacy is for individuals. So FOIA request would not be available for private institutions, but certainly would for all public entities. Okay.
What if it's somebody who is a public official, but they're doing public business using like their personal Gmail account? Does that shield their information from the public view if they're using that instead of their .edu or their school district account?
No. Generally speaking, if it's about public business, regardless of the medium, regardless of the means of communication, whether they're texting another teacher or whether they're using their Gmail account with another teacher, if it's about the public's business or if it's using public funds, it's going to be open to the public. And I think that's an important point, too, to be clear about that in records requests, that if you're seeking all communications, and again, you have to balance this against what Will was warning against about being real specific, because that is a very important point. But if you're seeking all communications, specify that you're seeking all emails, regardless of email account, all text messages, regardless of where they're stored for such and such topics.
Okay. And I think we've seen a couple examples recently of district officials trying to conduct business off government accounts by texting. I think it came up in Boston. Some text messages came out where they were making fun of Boston public school officials, were making fun of parents after they tried to change an admissions process. We've seen people try and, I think there were some school board members in Texas that actually were subpoenaed by a grand jury for trying to conduct district business out of view of the public eye. So it's interesting that they try to get around it, but we can still, in the end, we as taxpayers are still entitled to that information.
Well, yeah, and another point too is there are laws in a lot of states, and this is also laws at the federal level that say public entities have a duty to maintain public records, in certain ways. So oftentimes, if people are trying to get around these laws, it's possible they're violating some statute or some policy or regulatory requirements. So holding public officials accountable to those requirements would be a really good, important use of the public records laws as well.
Okay. Here's another question. What kinds of topics do people actually request? Like what things do you see parents asking for from school districts, or just community members asking for from school districts or states at this point?
Yeah, I can take a crack at that, and John, I'm sure you have insights as well. So, what we see is, just in my experience locally, things like contracts certainly come into play, because it's also that really gets to how are we using our taxpayer dollars? Are we using it in a way that a school system should be? So we see a lot of that, and it's generally around things like DEI or social emotional learning. You see certain requests around kind of gender ideology and things like that. Trying to understand how the district is approaching that. And then also, internal presentations. We've gotten some FOIA results on internal trainings that the school district has done. Again, to kind of see, how are our teachers being coached to talk about these things and present on these things. So the third one I would mention is, we see some on district-wide curriculum. So or say social emotional programs that the district is using. I think in saying that, an important point I would highlight is we shouldn't always go straight to FOIAs as parents, right? So if there's a concern with a school or a specific curriculum or a teacher, go to the school and the teacher directly where possible, right? Because I think that helps get you better information. It helps to build relationships, and come out in a better spot. But when you're talking about district-wide stuff, certainly that's something that's worth going through the FOIA process. And then at the state level too, and we can FOIA state level topics. So things around, like in Colorado, we have our social studies standards being revised right now. So things like that, we see FOIAs going out on as well.
Okay. Once I get FOIA results, what's the best way to share it with other parents? Will, how about you? How have you shared your results that you have gotten so far?
Yeah. So I would say, number one, sharing is a really important point, right? You don't just want to kind of keep this information internal. What we've seen is sharing it through your group. Are you part of a parent group or community group that you can then broadcast those findings to? We also see sharing it at, say, school board meetings, via public comment. We've seen FOIA gathered information shared that way. Sharing it with, say, school board members or district leadership that might not be aware of it, or to at the very least make them aware that you now know, you have information that they should know that things like that. And then also take it to local media. And if it's appropriate, take it to national media. I think there's a lot of outlets right now that really, want to shine a light. And I would certainly put a plug in for Parents Defending Ed in this too. I mean, sharing it with great organizations like Parents Defending Ed, who can then broadcast it more broadly than you as a single parent can.
Yeah, well, we love to share it. We ask everybody, if you get a great FOIA, you get something juicy, let us know, because we want to share it far and wide. We want to pitch it to reporters. We want to put it on our indoctrination map, right, so that everybody knows about it, because this is how we hold people accountable for the decisions they make, for how they spend our tax dollars, for how they treat our children. All right, one last question. Can a school district refuse or deny a FOIA? Does that ever happen, John?
Yeah, it does happen. So the first question is the information sought a public record, or is it public information within the meaning of the statute? And generally speaking, the way these statutes are written is very broad. So most things are going to qualify as public information or as a public record, unless you're asking for an employee's personal, calendar or something like that, that doesn't have to do with their school officials or their school activities. So first question, is it a public record? If it is, and again, the presumption is, these are broad definitions and the presumption favors disclosure. So that should usually be able to satisfy that test. The second question then is it exempted? So each state involves different, each state has different exemptions that apply. So for example, if there's a privacy interest involved, you probably can't go and request social security numbers of every teacher in the district or something like that, because they have a privacy interest in that information. Sometimes if there's a commercially protected product, maybe a university professor is developing something that they're about to get a patent on. I mean, kind of narrow type stuff, but some of these exemptions might apply, in which case a public entity will say that they apply. And importantly, the burden of proof is on the public entity to prove that an exemption applies. So don't just accept that at face value. Really pin down the entity as to what exemption they're claiming and why they believe it applies. Burdens of proof are really, really important in the law, right? I mean, we're all familiar with somebody's accused of a crime. The burden of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. That means that the person can go in there, sit and say nothing, and the government has to marshal evidence as to why, why something should be done or not. In this case, the government must prove why an exemption applies. So that is a long way of answering your questions. Yes, these things can be denied, but they can only be denied if it is not a public record, if a record doesn't exist, or if some exemption applies. And back to Will's point, Keep following up with them. If you get those sorts of answers, follow up with them in writing and make sure that everything is well documented so that if it comes to the point when you need to compel production, either administratively or legally, you got a real clear record and a good basis for doing so.
All right, awesome. Now, John, where do people go to find your guide? And then how do people contact the Goldwater Institute if they have an issue or a question?
Sure. Our main website, goldwaterinstitute.org, is a good starting place. And we also are launching a separate web page called openmygovernment.org, which will specifically have the guide and this information on public records law state by state.
Excellent. Cool. And Will, how do people follow what you and your organization are doing and get involved? I mean, they want to follow your lead. You can be your Pied Piper.
No, absolutely. So I'm on Twitter. You can contact me there. It's just Will Johnson 08 through there. And then the organization that I'm a part of locally is called FAIR, and the website there is fairforall.org. So recommend people check that out, and certainly willing to help however we can.
Awesome. Great. All right. Any final thoughts? Will, John, who wants to start? Maybe John.
Sure. Well, first, I just wanted to thank you, Nikki, and Parents Defending Ed for everything you're doing, getting this information out to parents so that parents can hold their districts accountable, educators accountable. Thanks to Will for all the incredible work. I mean, just knowing, I bet you in Will's school district, just knowing that Will and the other parents are there and they're making these requests under the FOIA or under the Public Records Act, I bet you that's changing a lot of behavior in a lot of ways. Because if people know someone's watching, they're going to act like somebody is watching. So thanks to both of you. I'll just say my final thought is these public records laws are very good tools. They exist to open government operations to you, to the public. It's one of the few areas of law where the presumption is in favor of the citizen and not in favor of the government. So please use these tools if you are using them and you run into problems, if you're facing legal barriers or a request is denied in a way you don't think it should have, please contact us. Please contact the Goldwater Institute. Please contact Parents Defending Ed. There's resources out there to help you.
Great. Thank you. And Will, how about you?
Yeah, absolutely. I would just echo John. Thanks, Nikki, and all that you're doing, and the Parents Defending Ed team. It's just such a great resource for so many parents across the country. And John, the Goldwater Institute, you guys are doing great work there. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that guide and using it. I would say, parents, you have a right to transparency. You absolutely do. But you have to use it. We have to exercise it. And FOIAs are an important way that parents can exercise our sphere of influence. We all have a real sphere of influence, even though it doesn't always feel like that. But again, what FOIAs do, they help to increase transparency and accountability in the school district. And when we do those things, we help encourage cultures of strong partnership between parents, teachers, and schools, which ultimately helps all kids thrive. So I'd say I'd encourage everyone to exercise your right to do this, and certainly here to help. So thank you so much.
I'm so grateful for both of you. I mean, the kinds of things that we and you and John, your clients have found over the past year is astonishing. I mean, it makes your jaw drop. We did the FOIAs that found everything with the National School Board Association, working with the administration on the whole domestic terrorism FBI thing, which was jaw dropping. But even down to, how districts are spending money, how they are training teachers, what kinds of lessons are going out. I think relationships between teachers and families, schools and families right now, it's pretty frayed. And I think for good reason, because people are shocked on a regular basis as to the kinds of things that are being taught. And so I think, obviously we want to restore that trust between schools and parents, but I think the only way to do it is, as you said, through transparency, through letting us know what's going on, because at the end of the day, there are children. We care, and we're not going to back down. We want to know, and we're not going to give up. So I thank you both, for Will for being a role model for us, John for defending people's rights to access this information, for letting people know how to exercise their rights. I would urge everybody who watched this to go to the Goldwater Institute's website and check out their new resource, Anatomy of a Public Records Request. And if you successfully use your FOIA powers and you find something interesting, please send it to us at Parents Defending Education, because we want to put it on our map. We want to send it, we want to share this information. We want to expose and hold all these schools, all these officials accountable for the decisions they make. Please don't forget to share this video, tag us if you do so. And I think that's it. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a great evening. See you soon.